The other day, my wife caught a glimpse of a tackle warehouse box that I was discreetly bringing into the house. And she looked at me and in all sternness says, "Look me in the eyes and tell me you haven't bought more fishing tackle." So, I cannot tell a lie, dear. Okay, let's dive into the message. We're going to be looking at Nehemiah chapter 4 today, and I would just say amen to Christian's prayer that God would really open our eyes, challenge us, but also encourage us as we look at some of Nebuchadnezzar's good works that he did. Before we dive into that, though, I think it might be helpful to give a real brief overview of where Israel is at this point in time in their history. Remember in 586, you Bible history buffs will remember that Nebuchadnezzar came down and conquered Jerusalem and deported many of the people to Babylon. And he also looted the temple and carried the articles that belonged to the temple off to Babylon as well. Then in 539 BC, Persia conquers Babylon and Cyrus becomes king. And in his first year, he allows some of the exiles to return to Jerusalem. And a man, Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel, lead some of the exiles back to Jerusalem, and Zerubbabel rebuilds the altar and eventually rebuilds the temple as well. And the temple is completed in about 516 BC, 70 years after Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed it. And the people celebrate the Passover there for the first time in 70 years, really in fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy in Jeremiah 25. By the way, a little known fact, or often read over, Zerubbabel is in the line of Jesus. So you'll run into him in Matthew and also in Luke in the genealogies of Jesus. About 60 years after that, 458 BC, Ezra comes on the scene and leads a group back to Jerusalem, the second group of returnees. He's a leader among the exiles in Babylon, and he's also a scholar as well as a teacher of the Torah. 13 years after that, 445 BC, Nehemiah leads a third group back to Jerusalem, and he rebuilds the wall and kind of puts the city back together and protects the city. Nehemiah is an interesting character. He is a tough, no-nonsense leader. He's also a very wise leader. And I want to focus on his strategy that he employed in defense of Jerusalem. Nehemiah 4:14, he says, "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes." Now, the reason they needed to be prepared to fight was that they were surrounded by people who were hostile to them and to their cause. In fact, in chapter 2, verse 10, he says, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official, and then later on we're also introduced to a man named Geshem the Arab, he was also part of the resistance. When these men heard about this, that they were actually, Nehemiah was there to start rebuilding the wall, it says they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. They were not happy at all. And so Nehemiah knows that rebuilding Jerusalem is going to be an uphill battle. So he wisely has the people build sections of the wall that are nearest to their homes. They couldn't leave the defense, their defense to anyone else. There wasn't no one else. Their security was their responsibility. And what stood out to me through chapter 3 especially was that the men assumed the primary responsibility for the security of the city and their families. And the women were not excluded. They helped build the wall too. In fact, there's a group of them mentioned specifically in chapter 3, verse 12. But the point that Nehemiah's strategy is that each family was responsible to build a portion of the wall that was nearest to their homes. And women play a crucial role in defense of our families even today. But as in Nehemiah's day, men need to step up and engage in the training of our children and our grandkids and not let the responsibility fall solely on the women like it often does. Now, because of the scope of the threat that was surrounding them, the entire community also needed one another to meet the opposition. In chapter 4, verses 19 and 20, it says there, I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is extensive and spread out, and we are widely separated from each other along the wall. Whenever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us there. So what he did is he assigned portions of the wall to people that were nearest to where they lived or to where they worked, so to speak. But it's a big area, and so they're scattered out. They're scattered all over the place. And so he keeps the trumpeter, the bugler, with him. And he says, whenever I see an enemy attacking in some direction, we'll blow the horn, and you guys come running. We need to come together to fight this off. Now, we don't have an army threatening us like Nehemiah did, but we are immersed in a culture that is hostile to our faith. The extreme pressure is being put on the institutions of the family, of marriage, and even what it means to be a human being. And this isn't just a culture war that Bill O'Reilly used to talk about. This is an all-out battle for the hearts and minds of the people we call family. And it requires all of us, men, women, and the church, to work together to secure our children's faith. We're not surrounded by a military force, but we are surrounded by a culture that is hostile to our faith. So I want to talk about culture for a minute. What is culture? Typically, we think of culture as a synonym for all the bad things that happens in the world. But culture is really much bigger than that. In a book, A Practical Guide to Culture, which I think is a must-read to anybody who wants to understand what culture is, what it's doing, its dangers, its benefits, and what to do about it. It's A Practical Guide to Culture by John Stonestreet and Brett Kunkle. They define the word culture, I think, quite well. The word culture comes from the Latin word cultura, which means agriculture. If plowing, tilling, and cultivating come to mind, they should. It is, in its most basic sense, culture refers to what people do in the world. We build, we invent, we imagine, we create, we tear down, we replace, we compose, we design, we emphasize, we dismiss, we embellish, we engineer. So culture is simply what humans make of the world. It involves our values, ideas, institutions, relationships, inventions, creativity, art, business, architecture, on and on and on it goes. Human beings were created in God's image to, like Him, develop culture that would emulate and honor Him. And it goes all the way back to the first chapter of Genesis, verses 27 and 28. God created humankind in His own image. In the image of God, He created them, male and female. He created them. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Now, the word subdue literally means to bring under one's control for one's advantage. You could paraphrase that verse, harness its power and use its resources for your benefit. And in the ancient Israelite culture, it suggested to them cultivating fields, mining minerals, using trees for construction, domesticating animals. A lot of those things you see depicted in Genesis chapter 11. Culture is one of the things that makes us different than the animals. But culture is not inherently bad. But since the fall, what we make of culture can be extremely bad. In some cultures, people love their neighbors. In others, they eat them. So we can create cultures that dehumanize people, that marginalize moral standards, that drive God out of the public forum and even deny his existence, or that see unborn babies as just nothing more than disposable inconveniences. And the list goes on and on and on and on. And that's the part of culture that many of us are concerned about. So Nehemiah says, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your home. So how do we do that? How do we fight for our families? I think the place to begin is really to recognize that we live in a hostile culture, a hostile environment. In the opening 3 verses of chapter 4, Nehemiah says, when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates in the army of Samaria, he said, what are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from the heaps of rubble, burned as they are? And then, of course, Tobiah has to get in the act, and he says, what are they building? Even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones. Now, our kids and our families are encountering similar challenges to their faith. Their faith in certain contexts are being ridiculed, and they're being ridiculed for their values as well. John Stonestreet calls the issues and the debates and the controversies that really dominate the 24-hour news cycle and a lot of the social media feeds, he calls these cultural waves. But beneath those obvious things are subtle, often unseen cultural undercurrents that actually shape how we think and live. And if we fail to recognize that we live in a hostile environment, if we fail to pay attention to the undercurrents of the culture, we will be unprepared when the ideas about sexuality, gender, marriage and family, and even the value of human life hit us like a tsunami wave. And we have experienced tsunami-like shifts in our culture, and it's left many of us disoriented and wondering, how did this happen? How did we get here? And it feels like, at least to me, it feels like we've been hit suddenly by this gigantic cultural shift. But really, it hasn't been a sudden shift at all. It's been building for decades. But we've failed to understand and respond to the undercurrents as they developed. In fact, clear back as far as 1949, T.S. Eliot wrote, "The problem of leading a Christian life in a non-Christian society is now very present to us. And as for the Christian who is not conscious of his dilemma," in other words, he doesn't recognize that he lives in a hostile environment that is hostile to our faith, and he's in the majority, he says, that's most Christians of his day, he is becoming more and more de-Christianized by all sorts of unconscious pressure. The undercurrents of culture is really eroding our faith personally, and we're not even aware of how much it has eroded and is eroding. Because he says paganism holds the most valuable advertising space. Culture's greatest influence is what it presents as being normal. In fact, C.S. Lewis made a statement that I think is just profound. The most dangerous ideas in a society are not the ones that are being argued, but the ones that are assumed. Francis Schaeffer, he was, many of you are familiar with him back in the 70s, a pretty articulate Christian, I guess you'd call him a philosopher, way ahead of his time. He used to say that ideas and societies typically deteriorate from the unthinkable to the thinkable. In other words, things that were once unthinkable now become acceptable. Stonestreet, though, takes it a step further. He characterizes the cultural shifts that we've experienced in the last decade as going from thinkable to unquestionable. We can't argue a lot of these ideas. without being told to sit down, shut up. If we want your opinion, we'll give it to you. But the real unthinkable here is to let this next generations grow up and face this culture with no guidance, no mentoring, and no help from us. That will guarantee that they will be victims of bad ideas. So we need to help kids and adults too navigate these waters so that they don't think everything that the culture portrays as normal is normal. But we shouldn't just hopelessly throw up our hands in despair thinking that there's nothing we can do. Remember, God has made us with the ability to impact culture. We can raise the next generations to not only survive culture with their faith and their moral absolutes intact, but to make a difference in culture. They can become champions of truth, but they will need our help. Don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. So not only do we live in a hostile environment, we live in a rapidly changing environment. And I think one of the most tsunami-like changes in our culture has been the information age. Our world used to be, it's actually shifted dramatically from an agrarian society, that of farms, to an industrial society, and now we find ourselves in a world dominated by glowing screens. There isn't a single area in life that the information technology hasn't shaped dramatically. For example, just out of curiosity, how many of you have an actual Bible here? Ooh, you guys are good, quite a few. How many of you are using a Bible app on your phone or your tablet? Yeah, a lot of us, huh? I mean, you can't deny how convenient it is. You can have hundreds of books on the little thing and not carry a pickup load instead. I remember life before 24/7 connectability. And I remember life before, not only did we not have access to the internet, we didn't have an internet. But the younger generations don't. They've never known a time without those things. And each time people go online, which is multiple times a day, they have access to more information than we can even imagine. 500 million tweets are sent every day, and that's just Trump, okay? 4 million hours of content are uploaded to YouTube. 4.3 billion Facebook messages are posted. 6 billion Google searches are conducted, and 205 billion emails are sent. That is a staggering amount of information that is at our fingertips, and that's only counting what's online. That's a far cry from the 3 channels that went on the air at 5 and went off at midnight that I grew up with. And many of you can relate to that, right? But sadly, all those technological advancements really haven't enriched our lives all that much. And again, going clear back to 1949, T.S. Eliot wrote, "The endless cycle of idea and action, endless invention, endless experiment brings knowledge of motion, but not of stillness. Knowledge of speech, but not of silence. Knowledge of words and ignorance of the word. All our knowledge brings us nearer to death, but nearer to death, no nearer to God. Where is the life, capital L, we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where's the knowledge we have lost in information?" Very profound. You'd think he just wrote that today, wouldn't you? Not 1949. We live in an age that has a wealth of information, but a scarcity of wisdom. This could also be called the age of ideas. Because every song, movie, tweet, sermon, news story, podcast, advertisement, all of those things tell us something about what to believe and how to live. Even information that we think is insignificant communicates ideas about life and the world and reality. Ideas have consequences, and bad ideas have victims. Culture's power is what it portrays to be most normal. Culture isn't most powerful where it's the loudest. It's most powerful and influential in shaping us where it portrays things to be normal and where it's unexamined and unchallenged. So, we recognize that we live in a hostile environment. How do we fight for our families in this environment? Well, we can cultivate political power. You know, government was established by God to kind of keep a lid on fallen humanity. So judicial reforms, appointment of judges that will interpret the law in light of their constitutionality instead of legislating from the bench, that's all good. But it's also temporary. Some of the reforms may last for decades, but they will not endure forever. In fact, Ronald Reagan said freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. All those reforms are temporary. Political power will only last for a season. It's temporary. Well, we could also build a wall around yourself and around your family and keep all the bad things out. That one really appeals to me. Moving my kids and grandkids to a compound in Wyoming, that's appealing. But when our kids became junior high age, we saw that pop music was beginning to have an impact on them, so we decided to allow only Christian music in our home. I even put away my Willie Nelson and Mo Bandy cassettes. That, by the way, is a cassette. It's amazing. Some of you have never used a cassette, maybe never even seen a cassette. But you know what? In spite of our best efforts, our kids still knew every pop song that came along. And I think it's because of what this old Chinese proverb says. If you want to know what water is, don't ask the fish. See, culture is to humans what water is to fish. It's the environment we live in and think is normal. And like fish in water, we are so immersed in ways of thinking and patterns of living that we become absolutely unaware of them and even unable to recognize them. In a word, trying to isolate yourself or your family from culture does not work. You can't wall it off because it permeates everything. So, what chance do we have against such odds? How can we fight for our families effectively? Nehemiah and Ezra do their best, but their political, religious, and social reforms don't address what is really the core issues of the heart. Externally, they made a lot of reforms, but internally, they had the same old heart that took Israel into captivity in the first place. Nothing had really changed on the heart level. And the books of Ezra and Nehemiah point out the same need that Jeremiah in chapter 31 and Ezekiel in chapter 36 pointed out. Our greatest need is a new heart. Our hearts need a radical makeover. So if we want our kids and grandkids to be faithful followers of Jesus, we must be faithful followers of Jesus. We cannot give what we do not possess ourselves. And our message will fall on deaf ears if our lives are characterized by hypocrisy and immorality. So a good starting place, I think, is that little book that Noah introduced us to a few weeks ago, My Heart, Christ's Home. And so we've ordered another batch. It's amazing how many of you have gotten them already, but we ordered another batch, and we have them in the Faith at Home Center for $2. So make sure you go back there and grab one of those. That is the place to start. Our hearts need to be transformed, not just the environment around us. And then, last, but of first importance really is pray. It's crucial that our hearts are right with God. It's essential that we study and learn to be discerning consumers of information and ideas. It's critical that we learn how to defend our faith and not be passive about it. In fact, in Nehemiah 4:13, he knew that he faced fierce opposition, so he says, I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords and spears and bows. And then in verse 17 he says, those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore a sword at his side as he worked. It's not enough to be aware of the challenges facing your family. We need tools with which to fight for our family. And we have a room full of tools in the Faith at Home Center back there. Most of them aren't for sale. There's a lot of books and stuff in there that are just for display only, so you can look through them and see if any of them would be helpful to you and your situation. So I would encourage you to go in and look around. A lot of the stuff, though, on the walls is free. I brought a couple samples. Here's one. You want to strengthen your marriage, improve your marriage? Here's a marriage date night recipe card, and it deals with the issues of love and respect. Some good information on that. It's free. It's out there on the wall all by itself. Here's one for young kids, creating impression points. Talk about combating the culture or standing against the culture. This would be a good start right here with your kids. And there's some really good ideas. If you're like me and you don't come up with very many of those good communicative ideas, there's a lot of them there for you that's already been thought out. All you got to do is follow the instructions, follow the recipe. If you will take advantage of the tools that are available to you, you will be able to equip the next generations, not just to survive a hostile culture, but to actually make a positive impact on it. But fighting for our families is hard work to which we must commit ourselves, and we must be intentional about it. But we can't do it on our own. Remember, the Apostle Paul said, our battle really isn't against flesh and blood. In Ephesians 6:12, he said, we do not wrestle, we don't fight. Our war isn't against flesh and blood, but it's against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. And Peter talked about the war being waged against us and our families, and he said, be alert and sober of mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. See, if you're not, in Eliot's words, conscious of your dilemma, you will be an easy meal. The battle in which we are engaged is a spiritual battle. And we must engage it with hearts that are committed to God and minds that are sober and alert. And like Nehemiah, we have to understand that the opposition is formidable and a lot bigger than us. So they prayed, as well as posted a guard day and night. We need to take action. We can't just sit on the sidelines and hope everything works out. It won't. And like Nehemiah, we desperately need our God to fight for us. Verse 20. Our actions need to be bathed in prayer. Nehemiah realized the need for an individual buy-in regarding the security of Jerusalem. But he also knew that they needed one another if they were successfully to defeat the opposition. And like them, we have to have one another's back if our friends and our families and even ourselves are to stay faithful to God. So I want to invite you to strap on your sword and join together in what we're calling the Nehemiah Challenge. Whenever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us there. Join the battle together. You're not just on your own. And pray that our God, the Lord who is great and awesome, will fight for us. So here's the Nehemiah challenge. Nehemiah organized the workers and the warriors into groups that had natural connections with one another. They were sometimes related to one another. They lived near a section of the wall that they repaired and guarded by one another. So we would like to become intentional in praying for one another as a church body. So if you're willing to commit to pray for another individual, couple, or family just for the school year, we're not even, asking you to, cut yourself and make a blood oath for life. This is just a school year, okay? We'll start there. If you're willing to make that commitment, fill out the Nehemiah Challenge insert that's in your bulletins there and put it in the offering basket or in the communication box that's out by the front door, or give it to one of us in the Faith at Home Center. And we'll collect them over the next few weeks. We'll have that in there for the next at least 2 more weeks. And then we will pair you up with another individual or family or couple that are similar to yourselves. Here's a copy of that if you didn't see the insert. And form what we on our student ministry trips used to call battle buddies. We'd pair one another up to pray for each other. And so we'll communicate to you and about the battle buddies through email only. So make sure on that sheet you include your current and accurate and legible email, okay? Does that make sense? Did I miss anything? Lori, Corbett, anybody in here? Okay, I think I covered it all. At times it seems hopeless, like a hopeless endeavor to go against the flow of culture. But God has promised to end the corruption and the evil and the injustice that seems to be overtaking the world at blinding speed. God gave the Apostle John a glimpse into the future while he was marooned on the island of Patmos. He wrote in Revelation 21, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. There was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.'" Talk about a tsunami shift of culture. "And he who was seated on the throne said, 'I'm making everything new.' Then he said, 'Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true.'" The book of Nehemiah shows us that God keeps his word. He keeps his promises. And the reforms that we most desire ultimately can only be found in Jesus. But we're called to be active participants. But only Jesus can really ultimately heal our hearts and the culture and ways that will endure. So as Apostle Paul wrote, he says, "To this end I labor, struggling with all of Jesus' energy, which so powerfully works in me. Pray and post a guard." We have work to do, but we also need to be empowered by God and by his power. So let's put on the armor of God and get after it. Amen. Amen. Let's pray. And I pray that you will stand firm, that you will let nothing move you, that you will be sober-minded and alert and not allow anyone to take you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, and that you will always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Amen.